Poppy, I think somebody wants your attention. I don't know about that. David handed me a cough drop, and somebody got me a water, so thank you and thank you. We'll see. Like everybody else, I've been struggling with a little of the, I don't know, the change of season, whatever, got a little allergy, whatever, something going on. But anyhow. All right. The check engine light on my car came back on again.
Get a piece of electrical.
I think that the repair shop programs it to go off about every 2 months, so I'll bring the car back in. It's a kind of a steady revenue stream for them. So it'll be some sensor that needs to be changed or something. That ain't. Daryl, the Orioles got swept in the playoffs.
Yeah, I'm bleeding orange and black.
Let's just take a moment of silence to say the Orioles lost in the playoffs. I blame the ownership. They should have spent a little bit of money to buy some extra pitching during the middle of the season, right? Go with all that good young talent. And then, I don't know, when there's a lot of moisture, my joints start hurting. Anybody have that happen? I mean, my ankle and my back, the chain, got a little moisture in the air. Oh, it's hurting. I got a little congestion. I love the fall, but you know what that means? That means all these people from the city are going to be showing up here next weekend, and then you're going to have traffic trying to get places. And then this election that's coming up, I'm tired of all the lousy candidates. Can't they get any really good candidates? Can't our country get its... When you get tired of hearing me complain, go ahead and raise your hand. I'm going to... All right. Karen says, I was tired before church started. What are you talking about? All right. All right, we'll put a stop to that. Anybody here ever complain? Am I the only person that ever complains here? Anybody else ever complain? Come on, raise your hands up. Be courageous. Yes, of course you complain. Do you ever wonder if you complain maybe too much sometimes? Maybe. Have you ever gotten the sneaking suspicion that complaining sometimes can hurt your relationships with people that you care about? Do you ever wonder? Maybe complaining is complaining ever a problem for you at any time in your life, maybe? Do you ever wish maybe there was something you could do about your complaining? Anybody ever feel that way? Does God have anything to say about complaining, I wonder? Let's think about that for a minute. First of all, can we admit everybody complains? If you did not raise your hand earlier about complaining, you're a liar, and you should be ashamed of yourself lying right here in church. Because we all complain. I read this week, one estimate is that the average person complains somewhere between 15 and 30 times a day. The average person complains. Don't believe me? Get you a little notebook and pen and start keeping track. Every time you complain, right? Write it. Check it off. See how much. Now, so everybody complains. We do it all the time. Question is why? Why do we complain? Don't have anything else to do. I'm not content with looking for obvious answers. I always got to dig a little deeper. But here's what one person a lot smarter than me, a psychologist, says complaining can be a way of expressing dissatisfaction with a situation, seeking sympathy. Sometimes we complain to get sympathy, right? Or attempting to initiate change. In some cases, complaining can be a way of seeking validation or connection with others. Do people ever complain in order to seek connection with others? As social creatures, we have a fundamental need to belong, and complaining can be a way of signaling to others that we are experiencing a shared struggle. Complaining may offer a sense of validation to the individual. Complaining, like all other communication, may bring a sense of connectedness between two individuals. Oh, so that's the mumbo jumbo. What does that mean? So you're standing in line at Walmart, right? And there's a long line, right? And there's like, what, 40 lanes, and there's 2 cashiers, and you got 20 people standing in line. So you're standing, and you're standing next to somebody that you've never met before, you don't know who this person is, and you say, why can't they just open up a couple more lanes? Why can't they call a few more cashiers? And I know, and the other person says, I know. So you're connecting with a total stranger because of your complaints. Yes, sir.
I complained about that.
You did. Did you?
You know what you said?
What?
You find somebody working, we'll put them in here.
Okay.
That's what you said.
Yeah, they probably did. They
Sit down.
having trouble finding that. Can't find enough people to work. But the idea is that sometimes we complain, it connects us together. If you've ever worked in an office setting or a place, where there's a bunch of employees, don't employees sometimes like to get together around the coffee pot or the water cooler and complain? Usually it's about their boss, maybe that's unfair, whatever, or maybe there's a coworker not pulling their weight. So sometimes complaining, I'm sure at one time or another somebody has said, that preacher of ours, he's a nice guy and all, but he preaches the longest sermons. I wish that man would figure out a way of saying what he says in less words. So, we do that. So maybe start a support group for. There's reason, and also, let's be honest. Now I'm going to tell you something that most preachers won't tell you. Okay, I'm going to tell you something most preachers won't tell you. Most of the sins that the Bible tells us not to do actually feel good. Right? I mean, let me be honest with you. Most sins, I've never murdered anybody. I don't know that feels good, I suppose. But complaining feels good for a little while, right? If you're upset about something and just spouting off about it, makes you feel good for about, a couple minutes, a few minutes. It's like a little burst. Kind of the same way that eating a candy bar makes you feel good for, when you're eating the candy bar and for a little bit until you finish the candy bar and you realize, well, that's not going to help my diet any, and if I do that too much, I'm going to, not be healthy. The same can be true with complaining. It can feel good. That's why we do it. It feels good in the moment. But here's the problem. Just like with that candy bar, if I'm eating a candy bar, 1 or 2 a day or every day, eventually it's going to be very bad for me. Excessive complaining can be a very, very, very serious problem. I am learning. According to Martin Seligman, who's a psychologist up at the University of Pennsylvania, he says complaining is not a strategy. It's not a way of taking responsibility. It's not a way of getting things we want. He says it's a way of avoiding responsibility, a way of blaming others, and a way of getting sympathy without having to take action. Wow, that's pretty mean, but probably true in many instances, right? What some psychologists have found is that while complaining can serve a legitimate purpose in certain situations, sometimes it does make sense to complain, right? If you're complaining to a person, maybe in the right setting, who has the power to do something to change whatever the problem is, like maybe going to the manager and saying, hey, look, we got a lot of people that are frustrated because we're having to stand in line too long. Maybe that was a good thing. But it is being discovered that excessive complaining can have negative consequences on our mental health. I don't know about you, my mental health's like this most of the time. Anyway, I don't need any help getting worse, Jeff. You know what I mean? I'm saying? So complaining can mess up. And it can have some other effects on other parts of our lives too, our relationships and physical health. Chronic complaining can lead to a negative mindset. We can become more negative. A lack of gratitude, a sense of helplessness. It can damage our relationships with others, as constant complaining can be exhausting and demotivating for people around us. So if you've ever been around somebody who complains all the time, it can wear you out, right? And so it can be a problem. And then it can reinforce negative beliefs, and it can actually lead to self-fulfilling prophecies. Daniel Kahneman, who's a psychologist, he says, we are prone to think of unpleasant thoughts as true thoughts. The more you hear it, the more you believe it. So even as you're complaining, the more you repeat something, your mind hears it, and it starts to assimilate that and think, oh yeah, that is true. The more you believe it, the more you act on it. The more you act on it, the more it becomes true. And then in the world of neuroscience, now they can study your brains and brain waves and alpha waves and all that sort of thing. And here it's been discovered that complaining can actually rewire the neurons in your brain. If you asked yourself how many times you complain today, it's probably innumerable. There are shocking flaws, though, when we justify that complaining makes us feel better. The shocking flaw in this reasoning says that not only does complaining actually not make us feel better, but it catches on and it makes our listeners feel worse. How does complaining affect our brain? According to this research from Stanford University, complaining reduces the size of your hippocampus, which is a part of your brain that is responsible for memory and problem solving. Anybody here ever struggle with remembering things that you want to remember? Do you want your memory to get worse? Because complaining will actually shrink the part of your brain that helps you remember things or solve problems. That doesn't sound like a very good thing to me. I need as much of this memory as I possibly can. I don't need less of it. A study found that engaging in complaining or simply hearing somebody else complain for more than 30 minutes can physically damage your brain. Did you know that? Listening to somebody complain for more than a half hour can do damage to your brain. Just like human beings in general, our brains don't generally like to work any harder than they absolutely have to. When we repeat certain behaviors like complaining, our neurons branch out to one another and make connections so that information is more easily transferred. The more frequently you complain, you increase your likelihood of thinking negative thoughts later on. The phrase in neurology is synapses that fire together, wire together. So basically, if you keep doing something often enough, all those parts of your brain kind of go there, so it kind of goes to a default. It like makes it faster, it makes it the default. So you're going to become more negative and more complaining if you do it too often. Going on, it says that complaining is not only bad for your brain, but it's also bad for your health. When we complain, the hormone cortisol is released in your body. So your body's releasing this thing called cortisol, which is responsible for your fight or flight response, right? That's like, you're in a conflict situation. Are you going to run away or are you going to fight? When our fight or flight response is activated, our brain redirects blood, oxygen, and energy away from other parts of our body. Repeated complaining results in cortisol being released in higher levels, putting us at a greater risk of developing heart disease, high cholesterol, diabetes, obesity, and strokes. None of those sound particularly good, right? We don't want any of those things. One study published in the Archives of General Psychiatry found that on average, people who are optimistic, like see things from a positive perspective, tend to live longer than pessimists, right? Let's see the negative. Optimists are found to have a 55% lower risk of death across all causes and were 23% less likely to die of heart disease. So being negative and complaining a lot can actually shorten the length of your life. Okay, that doesn't sound like any fun. So, like I said, complaining can feel good in the moment, right? Just like eating that candy bar gives you that jolt of, it feels good for a little bit, and then, it leads to a whole lot of bad things. But we're in church. What does it have to say about spiritual things? I'm glad you asked. Complaining has spiritual consequences as well as physical. Now, let me be clear as I begin this part. When it comes to complaining, the Bible is not 100% opposed to complaining at all, of all types. So let me be clear on that. Jesus complained. Okay. So just the act of complaining in and of itself is not necessarily a sin. So please don't go home and tell everybody, the preacher said that every time you complain, you're sinning. That's not what I'm saying. I am saying that a habit of complaining is bad for your physical health and your relationships and your spiritual health, by the way. But there are times when complaining, when done in the appropriate time and place and way, is certainly consistent with faith. Let me give you one example let me give you a few examples of Jesus complaining. So, anybody remember the story of Jesus going to the temple with the money changers? You remember what happened? He goes into the temple, sees all these people, they're ripping people off, extorting money and all that. What does Jesus do? Flips the tables over, doesn't he? But he says, this is God's house and you're turning it into a den of thieves. Isn't that a form of complaining? He's complaining to them about what their behavior is doing. They're not showing the proper respect and reverence and awe for God. So you could say, well, in that instance, Jesus complained. Was he wrong in his complaint? No. He was speaking to the people who were doing it, pointing out that what they were doing was wrong. No. Jesus complained when he was on the cross. You remember? He was on the cross. What does he say? I'm thirsty, right? He's been on the cross 3 hours. He's dehydrated. He's bled. He's sweat. Drops of blood. He's thirsty. But this is my favorite one. If you want to look this one up, it's in Luke chapter 7 in the Bible. Luke chapter 7. And the story, this guy named Simon invited Jesus to come into his house for dinner. It says at the time there was this sinful woman, right? So there's a woman who's sinful. She's been identified, known to the community as, I guess, being in some way immoral. And she brings this, she comes in where Jesus is having dinner at this house, and it says she brings in an alabaster jar of perfumes, a very expensive perfume. And there she's standing behind Jesus, and she's crying, and the tears are pouring down her eyes. And she uses those tears to actually wash Jesus' feet and then dries them with her hair. And then she takes this expensive perfume and anoints Jesus' feet. And the host of the party, Simon, who was a Pharisee, by the way, is just sitting there, he's very angry. He's upset. He's muttering. He's complaining to himself. And Jesus says, hey, let me tell you something. Let me tell you something, Simon. He says, look, see this woman here? When I came to your house, the typical Jewish hospitality is somebody comes to your house, you provide them with water, right, to prepare, wash for the meal, and including their feet. And in fact, in many, the appropriate thing is to have a servant wash their feet. And he says, Simon, this lady here, when I came in as a guest in your house, you didn't offer me any of the common courtesies of, water to wash, prepare for it. She's been over here washing my feet with her tears and drying them with her hair. And he says, when I came, you didn't give me the traditional kiss of greeting. You didn't welcome me in this way. But she's been kissing my feet since I came in. You didn't give me any oil to put on my head preparing for the meal. But she's been pouring perfume all over my feet. She's been forgiven much. And so she's very grateful. But you have only been forgiven a little, and so you love very little. Was Jesus complaining to Simon? Well, yeah, kind of. He says, you didn't greet me, you didn't show me hospitality, you didn't do all of these things. And so he's trying to teach him. So sometimes in the right time, in the right circumstance, complaining can be useful. And then, of course, the most famous complaint of Jesus is while he's on the cross, he prays Psalm 22. Psalm 22 begins, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? Right? That is a prayer. It's known as a prayer of lament. Right? Prayers of lament. By the way, 150 Psalms in the Bible, about a third of them are prayers of lament. A prayer of lament is either a way for an individual or for a community, a group of people, to come before God and bring their complaints to God. To say, God, this is what's happening. This is what I'm going through. This is my experience. God provides a way, a faithful way, for his people to bring together their pain, their suffering, their grief, their hurt in forms of lament. That is how we can be a faithful complainer. Let me give you one example of this. In Psalm 3, it says, "O Lord, my foes are so many. Many are those who attack me. They say of me, there's no deliverance for him through God. But you, Lord, are a shield about me, my glory, he who holds my head high. I cry aloud to the Lord, and he answers from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep and wake again, for the Lord sustains me. I have no fear, for the myriad forces arrayed against me on every side." Right? He goes on to talk about deliverance is coming from the Lord. That's a prayer of lament. It's basically a recognition. It's a bringing that pain. But it's faith-filled because it's recognizing that even as I'm coming with this pain and suffering, I'm doing so in faith, God, because I trust you and I believe in you. And even though I'm going through a very difficult circumstance, I trust and believe. I know that you've been there for me in the past through difficult times, and I trust and believe that you are here with me now through this difficult time, and I have faith going forward that you will continue to be with me. See, that's a faithful complaint. It's a lament, and the Bible is full of examples of this. So I'm here to say Jesus complained appropriately at times, and the Bible gives us a way to faithfully bring our complaints to God in form of a prayer of lament. And it can build community. When communities come, I'll never forget after 9/11 back, it's been over 20 years ago now, but after 9/11, the towers came crashing down. I was pastoring a church in Louisiana at the time. Our whole community gathered. We had people from every church, black, white, didn't matter. All of us gathered together. And we had a service. It was basically a service of lament. It was basically saying, this is a terrible thing that's happening. And we're just pouring out our hearts and our losses and our fears and all of this, our anger to God. And it was a way for our community to come together, right? So lament. Funerals are essentially that. They're a way for the community to come together around the bereaving families and lament and say, but it's doing it faithfully. It's saying, it's not negating we're going through a very painful trial, but it's also bringing that to God and saying, God, even though this is hard, even though we have a lot of strong feelings and emotions, we're coming together. And it can build community when we do this together. There are faithful ways to bring our complaints to God. And there are also faithless ways of complaining that are damaging in our relationships with others. And that's where we're going to go next. So Philippians 2, Jeff read to us from Philippians 2, beginning verse 14. And we've been going through Philippians. Paul is writing to the church at Philippi. And in this part of the letter, he is saying, do all things without grumbling or disputing. Do all things without grumbling or disputing. He's basically saying, church, quit your complaining, right? Quit your fussing. Paul is not the only one who does this. We're reading through the book of James. I'll give you a sneak preview a few weeks down the line. We get to James 5, verse 9. James, writing to the church, wisdom, says, do not complain, brethren, against one another, so that you yourselves may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. What's he saying? He's saying when you get there and you start complaining about each other, Jesus is standing right there listening, right? He's right there. Don't do it. Jesus is going to judge you. First Peter. Peter is another one. He wrote in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 8, he said, above all, church, love each other warmly, because love covers many sins. Welcome each other as guests without complaining, right? So all of these, Paul and James and Peter, all of them together are basically saying the same thing to us. To be a loving community that does not spend its time and energy complaining about each other or to each other. Now, what's that word that he's using? Well, the Greek word is a word that's sometimes translated as complaining or grumbling or grudging or murmuring. Murmuring. You ever do any murmuring? What's murmuring? Right. Jude 1:16 says, these are murmurers, complainers, walking after their own lust. So what's wrong? What's the big deal? Huh? What's the big deal, Pastor? What's this? Complaining feels good. You're going to take that away from me too, Lord? Take away. Let me just give you an example of when it might be a problem. So in Numbers, right, Bible tells us, learn lessons from Israel's history, right? Because they made every mistake in the book. And so if you learn how God dealt with Israel, maybe you can get a better idea of what God wants and doesn't want. So in Numbers chapter 21. Now remember, God has rescued them from being slaves in Egypt for hundreds of years. And he's brought Moses and he's led them out of Egypt. The 10 plagues and the blood on the doorposts, and God's miraculously set them free. And then parts the Red Sea, and going through the sea and the dry land. And they're on their way to the promised land. It's going to be wonderful and glorious. And Moses is leading them. And after being slaves for all these years, they're free, right? You're not slaves anymore. Hallelujah, wonderful. And what do? Doggone it, we're sick of this food. Why do we get the same stuff? The same food. And apparently, Moses was up to here. Apparently, God was up to here, listening to their complaining. Kind of like, you ever have little kids and go on a trip? Going on a car trip? Are we there yet? Can they stop? I'm hungry. I have to go to the bathroom. Just that kind of nonstop stuff. Well, Moses is just losing his mind. But anyway, in Numbers chapter 21, verse 4, it says, they traveled from Mount Hor along the route to the Red Sea to go around Edom, but the people grew impatient on the way. Moses, are we there yet? Why is this taking so long? Hurry up. Can we get there? They spoke against God. God, the one that just got them out of slavery in Egypt and has taken them to the wonderful land flowing with milk and honey. And they're complaining against God and against that 80-year-old man who's leading them, right? The man that said, I'd rather just stay out here taking care of sheep and have to go back and do this. But they're complaining. Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no bread, there's no water. And we detest this miserable food. What was the miserable food? The miserable food was the manna that God provided every single day to give them enough food to keep them alive. And they were fussing and complaining because they didn't like it. In another place, it says, oh, if we were only back in Egypt where we had cucumbers and leeks and all that. Yeah. Isn't it funny how time makes us forget? You were slaves. Don't you remember when you had to work 7 days a week building Pharaoh's cities, right? As you were slaves, you had no freedom. And if you didn't keep up your quota, you'd get the lash on it. Did you forget that? That's what you were saved from. And you're getting your needs provided, and you're complaining because you don't like the taste of the food that God's graciously providing you every day. So what does God say? Okay. The Lord sent venomous snakes among them. They bit the people, and many Israelites died. They said, Moses, we sinned against you when we spoke against the Lord and against you. Would you please ask God to get rid of these snakes that are among us? And Moses prayed for the people. So Paul is writing to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 9. He says, nor should we put Christ to the test, as some of them did and died from snake bites. And don't grumble, as some of them did, and then were destroyed by the angel of death. Paul says, these things happen to them as examples for us. In other words, you know, an example is right. You see, oh, that's okay. We don't want that to happen to us. Right. So Paul's saying, learn from Israel's mistakes and their history. They were written down to warn us who live at the end of the age. Right. So he's telling us to learn. And part of the lesson is don't become a consciously fussing, grumbling, complaining, ungrateful people. He's saying that to the church. Lots of people grumbled. They grumbled about Jesus. Did you know that? They grumbled about Jesus. In John chapter 7, it says, you know, what's Jesus doing? Well, he's going out and he's feeding 5,000 people with a few fish and loaves of bread. He's taking sick people and healing them. He's giving deaf people their hearing back. He's giving sight to the blind. He's making the lame walk again. He's doing all these things, and he's proclaiming God's love, and the kingdom is coming, all these wonderful things. And it says, among the crowds, there was widespread whispering about him. This Jesus, this Jesus. Some said he deceives the people. The Pharisees heard the crowd whispering, muttering things about him. The chief priests and the Pharisees sent temple guards to arrest him. The ungrateful people whom Jesus was pouring himself out for, all they could do was mutter and grumble and complain. So, back to Philippians. Paul wants the church to know, hey, church, that kind of muttering and grumbling and complaining and whispering, the kind of stuff that Israel did in the wilderness to Moses, the kind of stuff that people did around Jesus, complaining about him, was not healthy. It was not helpful. And so he says in Philippians 2:14, do all things without grumbling and complaint or disputing. In other words, get rid of this stuff. Why? And then he gets to the why. This is why it's important, church, for us to learn this lesson. That you, church, you followers of Jesus Christ, living now at the end of this age, that you may be blameless and innocent children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. How many think we're living in the midst of a twisted and crooked generation? Absolutely. Jesus says, you're living there in the middle of that. You don't want to get caught up in that muttering, grumbling, complaining, because it's your job to shine as lights of the world to this twisted and broken generation. Holding fast to the word of life, hanging on, clinging to Jesus and to his word, so that in the day of Christ, I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. He said, church, he says, I've been pouring myself out preaching the gospel to you. He says, I don't want when Christ comes back for that to just disappear because you allowed petty disputes and squabbles and grumbling to get in the way of what's truly important. Don't do that. And how many times has that happened? We've seen that happen, right? We've seen that. We've seen churches ripped apart over stupid, petty little squabbles. I've seen churches fall apart because they didn't agree on what color to put the carpet or to paint the sanctuary or what style to build the building, those kinds of things. And Paul says, I don't want to waste my time and energy and effort trying to preach Christ to you for you to let little petty little complaints undermine all of the good that Jesus did when he went to the cross for you. I don't want to run this race in vain, even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering. What a powerful symbol, Paul. I'm going to explain that in just a second. Pour out as a drink offering on your offering of faith. I am glad and rejoice with you. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me. All right? Paul says that the followers of Jesus who live in a crooked, twisted generation need to stand out as bright lights to the world. A church full of negativity and muttering and complaining doesn't do that, doesn't hold out hope to the world. It's weak and it's ineffective. Paul doesn't want that for his churches, for us. Instead of muttering and complaining, Paul says, I'm willing to have myself be poured out as a sacrifice. Now, what does that mean? In Israel, they would go to the temple and they would offer their burnt offerings, their sacrifices. And part of the sacrifices, so if I'm bringing this sheep or this bull or whatever, and it's being burned on the altar, there would also be wine that would be poured out as a drink offering, as a part of that sacrifice. And so Paul is saying here, he says, I'm willing to be poured out as a sacrifice. I'm willing to give it all. And that's a picture, by the way, of Jesus. When he was on the cross and he gave his blood, he was being poured out as a drink offering. And Paul is saying, I'm willing to have my own life poured out for the sake of the church, because we have an important job to do, to be lights to this world that is this twisted and perverse generation. Friends, I don't think it's any different today than it was in the first century when Paul wrote this to you. I think we're at least as twisted and wicked generation today as it was then. And so the importance of us, the church, putting the things of God ahead of our own, sometimes pretty petty little differences and complaints. That's our offering. Instead of a life full of muttering and complaining, Paul says he finds his joy in his willingness to sacrifice. In other words, he considered it a privilege to be poured out on the altar to the Lord. Now, I'm convinced, I don't know about you, but I'm convinced I need to complain less. Amen? I'm at least waiting for my wife to say something. Amen, hallelujah, praise the Lord. So let's suppose there's at least one other person out there who might feel the same way. I don't know. Where do I start? Here's some good suggestions that you might want to think about. If you find yourself complaining frequently, there are several strategies that you can use to manage your complaints and cultivate a more positive mindset. One approach is to practice gratitude. Now, I've been doing this. I think I started in 2018. I do this every morning. When I sit down and do my devotions in the morning, I think of 3 things from the previous day that I am grateful for. 3 things that I am grateful for. What is something that God provided for me, or something that I experienced for which I am grateful? Now, as I said, you can wire yourself to be negative and critical and complaining, or you can wire yourself to be grateful and joyful. Your brain, you see, that's a good thing about the brain. Our brain is not static. Our brain can be changed. It can be molded. You can actually change the way you think. You can change your brain. So practicing gratitude, you can shift your attention away from complaints and cultivate a more positive outlook. Another approach is to reframe your complaints as a request for change. So instead of just coming in and boom, 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 being nasty and critical, to frame it in a positive way. To say, would it be possible for you to X, Y, and Z? Did I say something funny? Can we reframe things in a more positive request? It's okay to ask for things, but instead of coming in from a negative complaining stance, to be more positive in request. Also, it can be helpful to seek out the support of others. Rather than complaining to everyone about everything, venting, think about a specific action. Maybe there's something that needs to be addressed. Maybe there's a problem that needs to be addressed, and you want to give attention to it. And then maybe you can find some others who can work together with you to help solve that problem. And then, of course, we've already talked about prayers of lament. Always a faith-filled way. Go through the Psalms. You'll find a prayer of lament if you need that to help bring that before God. One tool, some of you may know, I'm wearing this little purple wristband here, little purple wristband. A number of years ago, I read a book about complaining by a guy named Will Bowen, who was also a pastor. But he discovered that for him, just a simple reminder. And so he thought, it takes about 21 days to change a habit. So he said, what if I put this on there? And every time that I catch myself complaining, I switch sides. I switch the wristband from one hand to the other, just as a reminder. And what if my goal is, can I go for a whole day without having to switch the wristband from one side to the other? And he said, if you can do that, not for one day, but if you can get 1 day and 2 days and 3 days and 5 days, so if you can do that for about 21 days, your brain will start being rewired so that you will find yourself complaining less. He says it typically takes from 4 to 8 months of doing that discipline on a daily basis to do it. The question is what do we do about it? So if we are dissatisfied with something, do we choose to do something constructive to address it and fix it, or do we just choose to sit around and complain about it? He says, instead of complaining, let's figure out something constructive that we can do to address it. He says, this is really what it's all about. Are we going to be victims, or are we going to be creators? Are we going to be victims, or are we going to be creators of change? Now he says, you'll go through 4 stages when you do this. The first stage is called unconscious incompetence. Say that with me. Unconscious incompetence. Unconscious means you're not thinking about it. Incompetence means you don't have any skill in it. Right? So that stage is, I don't think about the fact that I complain. I'm unconscious. I'm not even aware of it, and I'm incompetent. I keep doing it. Right? Well, unfortunately, because I preached this sermon today, you can't stay in that area anymore. I'm sorry. Because I have made you conscious of it. Because you're going to start thinking about, oh gosh. Or your spouse is going to, oh, you're complaining again. All right. I will encourage you not to do that. Focus on your complaining, not your spouse's or somebody else's. The second stage is conscious incompetence, right? Now you're aware that you complain. You're still not very good at stopping yourself, but at least you're aware that you're doing it. That's conscious, I'm aware, incompetence. That will take a while, right? Don't think, well, I'm going to stop complaining. No, you're going to wear one of these bands out eventually, right? If you do that, you're going to wear one of these bands out with it. But eventually, maybe instead of complaining 50 times today, maybe it was only 25 times. And then maybe it's only 10 times, and maybe it's only 5, and then maybe it's only 2. And then maybe I went a whole day and I didn't have to change my wristband. And then I went a whole week. Wow. Didn't think it was possible. Your brain is being rewired. The third stage is conscious competence. I'm now aware that I am not complaining as much as I used to. I'm not complaining. I'm taking proactive steps, or I'm lamenting. Complaining to God and lament doesn't count, okay? So if you're bringing it to God, that doesn't count. That's not a bad complaint. Right? That's appropriate. And then the fourth stage is unconscious competence. That's when I don't have to think about it anymore. I'm so rewired that I'm just kind of naturally not that kind of person. Paul says, do all things without grumbling or disputing. I don't know how Paul managed to do it without this little piece of rubber, but he apparently figured out how to do it. Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent. Oh, by the way, you have the Holy Spirit of God in you, by the way. That's your helper. So you can say, Lord, I keep complaining. I need your help. Replace my critical spirit with a spirit of joy and peace and patience, fruit of the Spirit. Children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation. Don't expect that everybody else is going to change. No, this is not about you're getting other people. Don't go into, I'm going to work on getting my spouse to stop complaining so much, or my kids, or my parents, or my friends, or my coworkers. No, this is about you. You shining as a light in the world. That's God's invitation. Either way, it's to your benefit. God wants to rewire your brain to make you complain less. It's better for your health. It's better for your relationships. better for the church's witness. It will make us a more effective witness to the world, shining lights of Jesus. And just imagine what the world could be like if we put that energy that we put into complaining into doing positive things and being lights for Jesus. Anyway, I'm not forcing you to do